Hello and welcome once again to episode 55 of Code Completion. We're a group of iOS developers and educators hoping to share what we love most about development, Apple technology, and completing your code. My name is Dimitri and I'll be your host once again for this episode, and I'm joined today by my fellow completionist, Spencer.
Hey there.
So today, before we get into our main topic, it's time for our Indie App Spotlight. We are checking out Kwayet by Sun Adeyemi, a team messaging app for iPhone and iPad. So Kwayet, that's spelled Kwayet. It took me a while to realize this is just quiet. I was like, how am I going to pronounce this? But it's super easy. It's just Kwayet. It brings private messaging, calls, meetings, group chats, and your front desk all together in a streamlined interface so you can focus on collaborating together and getting work done. That's why it's quiet. Best of all, Kwayet is cloud-based but privacy-focused and doesn't even need a phone number to sign up. So Kwayet is free to try, so please be sure to support Sun and check it out today. And if you are an indie developer, we want to hear from you. Please reach out to us on Twitter at CodeCompletion via DM so we can spotlight your app in the future as well. So we've finally both gotten our dream machines, or at least I've gotten my dream machine. I don't know about you if you're happy with yours, but that's what today's episode is all about. So it's time for our reviews. Spencer, do you want to start with your setup?
Yeah. I didn't buy the Mac. It was luckily work bought it for me, so that was nice to not have to drop all that money myself.
A good investment.
Yeah, it was a good investment. Yeah, that I'm sure we'll bring it up in a few minutes, but that tweet about the amount of money that those Android developers will save just in compile times is insane. So I think a lot of people are really, really happy with the way that these all turned out, all things considered. I think the most controversial thing is the notch, which is, not really that controversial, I think. People are going to get over it, is what I mean, just like they did with the iPhone. So so work bought me like a baller M1 Max 64 gig of RAM machine. I got the 14-inch model. Ever since I bought my M1 MacBook Air, I've just loved the smaller size, and a lot of times I end up docking it and using it in clamshell mode anyway. So when I do need the screen, it's not a huge deal, but every time I would pull out my 16-inch MacBook Pro, my previous one, it's just it's an absolute unit. So I decided to go for the smaller one. And it's been really interesting. I've only had it for 2.5 days now, 1.5 days, something like that. So haven't, had a whole lot of time with it. But one thing I have noticed is just, of course, like compile speeds, but even things like code completion, right? Like autocomplete, that little window pulls up so fast. And I thought it was fine before, but now it's just instant. And that's been really nice, where you'll actually get those like Xcode 13 or whatever we're on, autocomplete of like guardlet statements and stuff. Whereas on my other MacBook Pro, it wouldn't load fast enough and I would just end up writing it myself. So the small things really have been the most noticeable for me, if that makes sense. I don't know about you, but that's been like so far my very quick couple day highlight of my new machine.
Well, it's funny, on a show called Code Completion, you bring up code completion being the thing that had the biggest impact.
I know, right?
For you. And totally not planned. But yeah, I basically echo everything that you said. I think I got mine a few days earlier than you. Like its uptime is at like 4 days as opposed to 2. And I love this machine. So you can kind of see it if you're watching the video version of this. You can see it in the background. I'm not actually using my setup. I'm still on the iMac that I'm used to recording on because it works. I don't want to re-attempt to get that working. But for everything that I'm putting this computer through its paces with, like, it's working beautifully. So I also got a 64 gigabyte M1 Max model. I went with the 16-inch because this is primarily going to be a desktop computer for me. I was not planning on buying a MacBook Pro until Apple said how amazing these MacBook Pros were. I was holding out, like, in all honesty, I was holding out for an updated Intel Mac Pro. Like I wasn't comfortable buying 2-year-old chips, but if they put the latest Xeons in there, I would have been fine with that as an upgrade computer for me, just because I needed something where I could put more RAM into. I could like have it do more than most of the other Macs that Apple has. I shared this on Twitter, but I want a lot of space for like what I'm working on, because it helps me to kind of scatterbrain and put like everything that I'm working on in front of me, and that is what helps me stay organized in a way. If I put something away, it's out of mind and I'm going to forget about it and never think about it again. But if I have space to actually lay things out and actually visually organize stuff, that's really helpful to me. So this is the first computer that I have that can drive like 3 high-resolution displays along with its own internal monitor. So I went with the 16-inch because it's going to stay on the desk. I'm never unplugging it. Like, I wouldn't want to use it without the monitors. Like, I have anxiety about reorienting Windows, and I'll get into that in a little bit later. But I like things where I leave them, and just unplugging a computer like destroys that on modern Mac OS. So that's a big problem for me. But if this is just staying on the desk permanently, then it's not altogether that big of an issue. So that works quite well for me. So I have a main Pro Display XDR in the middle, and then 2 LG 5Ks as like wings on the side. And the really nice thing about the LG 5Ks is their like regular vertical resolution is actually quite large. So you actually do have a lot of space, even if you use it as a vertical display, and that's really been really nice so far.
Nice. That's, yeah, I mean, kind of off topic from the actual machines themselves, but I agree with the space thing. I mean, that's why I was hunting for, you know, the perfect setup for me for a long time. And like, I think I've mentioned before, but my eyesight isn't great, so I can't really see anything past like 1440p, even, you know, a couple feet away. And so I ended up having 2 ultra wides, and then 2 ultra wides plus a 27-inch other monitor, and it just ended up being like, I mean, my field of view of monitors was almost 180 degrees, and then I found this super ultra wide, and that's like where it's been basically what you're saying, where you can have everything you want open at once, and things aren't minimized and stuff in the dock or whatever, and that's super annoying to me. So I totally get that. And
yeah, putting codes side by side and like have it not be limited in terms of line length is amazing.
Yeah, being able, I mean, I'm doing something right now where I'm making a new Swift file, but I'm sort of combining 2 classes together. Anyway, kind of a whole thing, but I'm able to pull all 3 classes up at once with a fair amount of real estate for both, where the code isn't squished or anything. So super nice for that kind of stuff. So one interesting thing, and I've had these issues with my M1 Mac and my MacBook Air, and I was hoping that it would get fixed with the updated chips, was like display issues in general. And, you know, I mean, I can't really fault myself for not using like an Apple approved monitor, I guess. I mean, this is like the weirdest, you know, aspect ratio and stuff, but I've tried many cables, DisplayPort cables specifically, to drive this display, and sometimes I'll get flickering or just very weird artifacts and stuff. And so I think I have a cable right now that works okay, but yeah, the Apple Silicon Macs have been not awesome for my display in general, which is interesting to say the least. You kind of have to rejigger the cable and you know, just hope that it works. And so when I unplug it and replug it in, then I have to do the same thing over and over again. So that's I think my biggest pain point, but it's not specific to the new MacBook Pro by any means. It happens on my MacBook Air as well.
I wonder if that really is related to the cables, because on my setup, the Pro Display XDR came with like a fancy braided cable that Apple, it's like $200 if you buy it alone. It's insane. And then one of the 5Ks, its cable that it came with like died, like it stopped working reliably. So I got the smaller, I had laying around a smaller Thunderbolt 3 cable, also by Apple, which is like $50. Again, not cheap, but it feels hefty. It feels like a good quality Thunderbolt cable, which you want when you're driving that many pixels. And the leftmost one, so that one that you can actually see, that one is still using the original LG cable, which is a Thunderbolt 3 cable, 2 meters, I think. But every time the cat like walks over that part of the desk, the monitor disconnects and it reconnects immediately afterwards. But any little jiggling is enough for that to not be a stable connection. So, as you said, it might just be the cable that there's one faulty connection that arcs a tiny little bit as it moves ever so slightly, and that might be enough to prevent it from like actively getting a connection.
What I was gonna say though is I was watching Marques Brownlee's review of the M1 Max. I think it came out today or
I
late
saw it
yesterday.
as well.
It was fantastic, and he brought up that he was, I think it was during a Final Cut Pro export, that the M1 Max MacBook Pro exported faster than his 50,000 28 core Mac Pro with an Afterburner card by like 30 seconds or something. It was something like with turbo mode on, it ended up being like 5.5 minutes or something, and the Mac Pro ended up being in the 6-minute range, which is just bonkers that these are faster than a $50,000 Intel machine. So
it's faster than a car. That's what a very expensive car costs, and it's faster than that. And I know real, like though, way more expensive cars exist. I'm baselining it on my like $23,000 Civic.
Yeah.
Anything more expensive than that is an expensive car.
I mean, hey, you could buy a Model 3 with that much money. So.
Yeah, and this is faster than that. Not in terms of like its ability to move. It ain't moving. It's staying put. But in terms of what it can do, it really is an amazing little chip that Apple put together. And you can kind of see this across most reviews. They basically said like the fans will not turn on if they don't need to, and like this is an audible difference when they need to like turn on, and you hear a slow little whisper of what you might just be used to, but it's uncanny getting used to not hearing that. If you use an M1 MacBook Air, for instance, it's like utter silence because there's no moving parts in it, and that is a very different experience than a lot of people are used to.
Yeah, I mean, myself, I've been using this MacBook Pro for the year that I've been at this current job, and before I had almost the same MacBook Pro, just the 2018 2019 models, and every day doing anything, loading up macOS, even you kick the fans on. So it's been very weird and really uncanny to just not hear it, and I'll hear other parts of my house that I'm like, I've never heard this before because I've always been used to the fan going. So yeah. So it's been cool. I mean, I don't know. It
runs cool. Yep.
It runs cool. It's, I'll put I've got it docked clamshell mode, but the vent is facing me, and I'll just kind of put my hand there. There's a little heat coming out of it, but it's nowhere near the amount that would be on the Intel machine. So it's just insane, the power efficiency. And, one of the first things I did before I kind of loaded everything up was I pulled up Geekbench and benchmarked it myself just for fun, because I like to kind of have that record, and it just smoked every other computer.
If your chip is not a lemon, right?
Yeah.
I don't dare do that.
No? I don't know. It's fun. I enjoy it. But it just absolutely smoked by like hundreds and hundreds of points on the single core score, and crushed on the multi-core score. So it's a beast. It's awesome. Obviously everyone's been looking forward to something like this, and I think Apple really delivered, and that's super exciting to be showing up Intel, where like this is like their real, I don't know, I consider this like the first real Apple Silicon MacBook Pro, where the M1 MacBook Pro, it's the same as the MacBook Air essentially with fans, but this is just insane. So from here, pretty exciting to see what will be next. And we've talked about like the Jade 4C dies and everything, and it's interesting how they've made M1 Pro and M1 Max and just said, oh, hey, let's glue on twice the GPU cores. So I feel like there's really no reason that that won't continue with both CPU and GPU cores. It sounds like that's a very scalable architecture, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. And for those wondering on Geekbench results, so if you have been paying attention, it seems like the M1 Max with 32 cores does not have double the performance as the 16-core M1 Pro, which does have double the performance as the M1 in terms of graphics and metal performance on Geekbench specifically. And this seems to be a limitation of the Geekbench benchmark, where it does not get the machine into high enough gear for it to actually spin up that fast. So you actually have to put it under a sustained load for it to activate everything. Otherwise, it's going to be like, yeah, you finished your task really quickly, and I did what I can. It's only been a few seconds or whatever.
No, for real, though, it when I run it, whenever you run Geekbench, it'll say something like, this may take for anywhere from 2 to 20 minutes, depending on, your machine and stuff. And it was well under 2 minutes for both the CPU and GPU tests. So
yeah, that's a problem when you want to actually test something out and see how well it does. If it does not take a while to do something, you're not going to get a good representative answer of how long it takes to do something.
Yeah, they definitely need to render something a lot larger, or well, it goes through a kind of a suite of tests and stuff. But for the GPU, they could do, we've talked about this in Slack. I don't know if we've talked about it on the show, but something like a Blender render where traditionally they can take 20 minutes for some of these benchmark renders that they have. That would be a much better way of determining the actual M1 Max speed.
Mm-hmm. And on the topic of Blender, I am keeping up with the development effort there to get the GPU rendering for the Cycles rendering engine available on the Mac. Obviously, Blender uses the GPU to render the main viewport and stuff like that, but to actually get a ray traced result that is CPU only for the time being on the Mac. And Apple is actually lending engineers to the Blender Federation. Is that what they call themselves? To actually implement the metal support. And the first commit came in last week, where they basically went through all the shaders and put a bunch of macros where they needed to be, so that way these shaders could be cross-platform, because lo and behold, it's impossible to have truly cross-platform code. You need to set up an abstraction layer if you ever want to get things to be working across many platforms. So this was the initial work to set up that first translation layer, if you will. And then the second one to actually get the metal device connected, that one landed a day ago. And it is probably going to be in review within the next few days. And this is not something that's going to happen right away in terms of getting Blender support. But it seems like it is planned for version 3.1 when that eventually does release in the hopefully not too distant future.
That's exciting.
But you did mention the Jade 4C die and the Jade 2C die. And as a quick recap of what that was, back in early this year, I'm not going to remember the month, April I think it may have been, there was some leaks that basically outlined Apple's silicon plans for their Pro machines. And you had the M1 on there, and then you had Jade C die cut, which was the M1 Pro, and Jade C die, which was the M1 Max. They also had two other chips, Jade 2C die and Jade 4C die. And John Siracusa of ATP made a wonderful chart that kind of outlines what this could look like. With these new chips, whether they're going to be chiplets or one actual die that's going to be ginormous, I think some rough napkin calculation put it at, if you were to have 4 times the surface area of the M1 Max, what this would cost if it were a single die, and it would be in the few $1,000 range. And this accounts for having margins that Apple is accustomed to and everything. So you can expect this to be a $5,000 chip, for instance, if it were one chip. If it is 4 separate chips, that is a completely different calculus. You're going to be looking at the $800 or so for the upgrade. That's probably going to be what it is going to be times 4, if you wanted to do some back of the envelope calculations. And what's really interesting about this possibility is if you take a look at the M1 Max, it has about 400 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth available to it, which is right up there with high-end GPUs. Like, yes, there are GPUs with more than that, but not significantly more. But if you take this chip and you multiply it by 4, and if they multiply everything by 4, you can easily see this gaining like pretty amazing memory bandwidth and pipelines available from the GPU to memory that have just been unheard of. So it's going to be really fascinating to see how Apple prepares this chip, if it's just going to be one chip or if it's going to be multiple that are kind of have a similar fabric in between all of them, and see how that all comes together. Because if there ends up being a chip with 1.6 terabytes of memory throughput per second, that is going to really unseat the competition in a way that they are probably not comfortable with, much like Apple is currently unseating like Intel and AMD on the CPU side. Like their CPU just takes 30 watts maximum. That's it. And it is performing as well as a desktop CPU.
Yeah.
But it's using nothing in terms of like power. Meanwhile, Intel just came out with their Alder Lake that smokes the competition and gets about a third better performance than Apple's M1 Max, but it also uses 250 watts of power. Yep. And that's not something that can ever fit in a laptop. And it's also not something that has the ancillary compute engines that Apple is slowly adding, including this really beefy GPU that is way bigger than the CPU if you look at the die shot. And it is the majority of this chip. So what we're really dealing with is a GPU with a CPU, with an integrated CPU. If you want to think about it that way, that's what Apple's system on a chip is. It's that kind of monster that we're dealing with. So it's going to be really, really cool to see how Apple's going to make use of this, because most apps aren't going to make use of like 100 or 200 gigabytes per second of memory throughput because they're not expecting it. Like just imagine 1.6 terabytes. That's going to be a bit insane, and probably really expensive in terms of memory. Like who knows if that kind of memory can even be socketed if you're going to go with that, because like GPU memory is not socketed. It is soldered onto the board because you need it as close as possible to the electronics that are using that memory. Like it can't be far apart. So it's going to be a paradigm shift, that's for sure.
Yeah. And like you said, like most apps probably aren't going to use it. And Marques Brownlee in that video, he said basically the same thing, even with the M1 Max and probably more with the M1 Max. I can't remember if he just meant for both of these machines or not. But he said, you probably don't need this machine if you're just, doing content consumption. It's more
it's a tool.
It's a tool, exactly. Yeah, that's what he said. It was great. And he, if you're doing content creation, you're doing development, you are doing something that merits this. Sure, it's very much, I think, like the 2019 Mac Pro was kind of positioned where it's a pro level machine in reality, not just with the pro moniker that they'll put on their iPhones, for example. It's very much kind of at that level where unless you've just got a crap ton of money and you just want to get the best thing, you probably don't need it. So, as great as it is, and I think Dimitri as well, we've been very happy with our M1 machines just as like whatever machines, right? Even development has been pretty okay, and the M1 Max has been awesome. But if I'm just watching YouTube or anything else that isn't, development, then my M1 MacBook Air has been great, and it was $900. So
yeah, and I won't even open YouTube on a computer because I am so used to like using that on an Intel machine, and YouTube will bring down my machine for whatever reason. Maybe I have too much other stuff open, and that's the tipping point, perhaps. But I've gone so used to doing a lot of these ancillary tasks that are not part of my job on an iPad, on a phone. And that is really my toy device. Like, I get a phone every year. Yes, so I have a device for testing. That's what I tell myself. But it's just because I like technology. But you can't really motivate that same thing with a $5,000 computer, which is what I paid for mine. Like, that came straight out of my top pocket. But the 16-inch MacBook Pro, the Intel MacBook Pro that I was using, was unusable for me. Like, there's something about the amount of Xcode projects I had to have open simultaneously, that are some running simulators, some not running simulators, and the amount of Safari windows I had open for active research that I'm doing, trying to solve the problems that I need to solve, that I ended up with a system that could barely function. Like, the mouse would lag. Typing was something where I would think about what I wanted to say first, and then I type blindly. And thankfully, I've gotten quite good at this as long as I pay attention to what I'm like typing with my fingers on the keyboard, because staring at the monitor won't help. Like, it's going to be a second before the first characters start coming in. Yeah. So I gotten used to like the worst possible case of not having a usable system to do what I need to do. And it's really amazing having something that can keep up with me. And I think I've said this before, but it's really important that technology and these tools keep up with you. Like, you are not the slowest. You should be the slowest factor, not the other way around. And I think, I don't remember if it was MKBHD or if it was someone else who said this. I think it was Rene Ritchie. He said that he had to give up before the battery gave out of his computer. Like, he was just using Final Cut Pro all day, and he gave up because he was tired. And he said, okay, I'm done working for the day. And he tapped out, but the computer was still like available and ready for him to do more work. And that's really something that we're finally at the point where we have systems that are no longer like waiting for, are now waiting for us rather than us waiting on them to kind of get what work we need to get done. Like the famous XKCE, I'm not fooling around, my code's compiling.
Right.
Like that, it's not even my code's compiling, my code's auto-completing. And I'm waiting for the window to stop giving me the spinning beach ball of doom, so that way I can know like what on earth I was even thinking about typing. Because if you've done any amount of Objective-C or Swift development, the methods are long. You don't memorize the methods. You memorize like an index of the potential methods that you might want to use, and you rely on code completion to kind of get you there. And as you said, it's that little thing is enough to make you productive or not, because once you lose track of what you're trying to do, then you go on Twitter because you're like bored waiting for your thing, and then you just completely put off whatever effort you're trying to do onto the next day. Like, you gave up for the day almost. And that's what it felt like using a computer up until now. And I know I'm rambling at this point, but I really feel like it was due to like the current version of macOS that just gets a little bit sloppier every year. And you get to the point where you can no longer do things that you got used to doing. Like, I was used to having tons of Safari windows open on a G3 iMac. Like, this is they didn't call them MacBooks yet. And this is like before Intel. It was just something I was used to doing. Like, the system handled it fine of having a ton of windows open, because guess what? All those windows were not necessarily doing a ton. They were not separate processes. They weren't running into any sort of resource limitations because they had to work on a G3 iBook. And like, that's what I got used to. And as computers got better, the software almost got worse, to the point where I could no longer like sustain that same kind of work habit. And that is kind of unfortunate for me, because I was then unable to work as efficiently as I could. And I am hopeful that those days are behind me. That's, I guess, is the long way around my spiel.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting that you bring it up, because I think coming from when I started learning programming and iOS development specifically, and knowing a little bit of how it used to be done, and in macOS development, with manual reference counting and being very judicious about your memory and resource usage, I think especially me, it's so much of an afterthought that unless I see like I'm using a ton of memory where, I don't know, I have some just recursive loop or whatever that's just eating up memory, I don't think about it. And it's really nice, but I think that's also probably part of the issue where whether it's app developers or maybe web developers in your case, where they're just using a bunch of JavaScript crap in the background to do whatever analytics they want, it's just eating a bunch of resources as well. So, or
just Safari. The fact that everything needs to run in a separate process means you need to duplicate effort per process. That slowly eats into resource limitations. I remember on this iMac that I'm using, this iMac works great for the most part. However, I would reach limitations where I either have too many Safari windows open or one too many Xcode projects. I'm talking about 3. Okay. And an Xcode project is run in a Git repository, and a Git repository ends up having a lot of files that shuffle around. So if you're switching branches, you're opening and closing tons of files. So this is what the computer is dealing with. And the symptom that I would see weekly, I launch an app that was closed because I realized that my habits are not good for the computer. So I'm like closing stuff I don't need, right? So I launch up TextMate to do an ancillary text editing thing. And it bounces and bounces and bounces and bounces and bounces. And do you know what will make it stop bouncing? Closing a Safari window. Maybe 2. Or closing an Xcode project will instantly make it stop bouncing. Like there's some thing that is preventing the system from making progress, and it's just waiting for a resource to free up. And it's not because it's out of RAM. There's 64 gigabytes of RAM on this computer. And for the most part, only about 70% of it is in use at any given moment in time. So, like, what is it then that is causing those kinds of problems? I don't know. Like it's something that's gone worse over time, especially as they try to make the system more efficient, so it swaps less. I liked swap. Swap worked fine. You get used to a little bit of slowdown, and everything is a little bit slower, but things don't stop working. Like as we were recording this, my audio just decided to start giving out and give us a bunch of static. So you might hear some static early on in the episode. We ignored some of it, but then it got to an unbearable point. And that's just a regular occurrence for me. I need to now kill Core Audio Daemon. That is just something that I need to do on a daily basis. And that is frustrating, to say the least.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I agree that I think maybe we're at the point where the computer can keep up with us even with all of macOS's shortcomings and everything, and that's cool to not I guess get out of that like flow or zone, right? Like where like you said, you're the slowest thing, and so you can go as fast as you should
be.
Want.
We're humans. We should be the slowest thing. Like we're not calculators.
Yes, exactly. When the computer's doing literally trillions of operations a second or whatever, that's amazing. And if it just gets hung up on giving me my autocomplete, then that's a bummer. And like you said, it takes you out, and then you're like, oh, okay, well, I'll check Twitter or whatever, and it's just a bummer. So having your tool be faster than you are, I think, is a huge thing to kind of make it the most frictionless setup that you can. And to me, if I was doing freelance work or whatever, and I didn't have a job that would just buy this for me, I would most definitely do it, in my position, because that just even these last 2 days or so have been so nice. And it really has, I think, been a great way for me to stay on task and get more done. So that's super cool. I mean, compile times and everything aside. So.
Yeah, for the most part, like people like to bring up compile times, like, oh, compiling takes a ton of time. No, it doesn't. But like, no, generally speaking, you changed one line and the thing starts compiling. Yeah, like every now and then, yes, you need to wipe drive data and make things better. Generally speaking, though, you really don't. Like, it's oftentimes your fault that something is not working. It's not the fact that you have stale build products. And yes, sometimes stale build products do creep in, and clearing out the build folder does make things work again. But a lot of times it doesn't, and it's just like one of the things we generally try, you know?
Yeah, I really honestly haven't noticed build times as much as like the autocomplete for me personally.
Yeah. Or waiting for the simulator to launch. Like that is a tangible thing that just takes forever and has nothing to do with build times. And even on large projects where you have tons of dependencies, like yes, the first build takes a little bit, but you're not hard at work solving your problem during the first build. You've done the first build just to see if things still build. And that's the step one of like walking up to the computer is like, am I going to get any work today? Do things compile? Command B, just make sure a sanity check if that's going to go. But like waiting for the simulator, which you need to do to wait for live previews to launch, like that is something that takes a long time. And even that just being ever so slightly faster, or in the case of the M1 Max and the M1 Pro, like nearly twice as fast as the M1. And the M1 was already many times faster than any Intel machine because the simulator is running on native hardware at that point. Not that it wasn't on Intel, but it was optimized for ARM and that kind of ecosystem. So those like death by 1,000 cuts have like slowly been removed, or not slowly, they've been instantly been removed, and that is such a refreshing gust of like fresh air, I think, that I'm very, very happy for. Like even just the 16 gigabyte like RAM limitation of the M1 is something I felt every few days because I have a lot of things open in Safari, for instance. And that is not going to change, like whether I'm on one computer or not another. I think my iCloud is kind of cursed. That if I log into a computer, which is like one window, Safari is like freaking out a little bit because it's like, you have 500,200,000 iCloud tabs open on your 17 other computers. Like I have a feeling that happens. And ironically enough, Mail has a bug where on Monterey, like it will just gobble up memory. And I know better. I have not launched Mail on my new computer yet.
Good
because
idea.
if you follow me on Twitter, you'll know that I have 62,000 something unread emails, and that is just the unread ones. So there's a lot of email for that poor little app to kind of digest. And if there's a bug where it's going to leak memory, that's going to be an issue. But with 64 gigabytes, like I was so happy to see in iStat menus, no swap, and like 400 megabytes free, and some compressed. As soon as the free started like getting dangerously close to zero, the compressed bar kind of grew as a result of that. So things are like managing just fine. And I am super, super, super happy of it about it.
It's exciting to think about what the next iteration will be. I mean, I'm thinking like this is going to be one of the most future-proof laptops for a long time, but like maybe not. Maybe it's, you know, we see some gnarly upgrade even next generation. I don't know. Pretty cool. I saw that Apple's reportedly already working on like a 4 nanometer process, so they're already shrinking transistor size and everything. So there's a lot to look forward to.
So that actually kind of scares me. So let's take this as like a little mini topic.
All right.
You suddenly give a bunch of people really, really, really fast machines. What do you think happens as a result?
They expect faster.
Not only do they expect faster, they get used to that speed, right? So
Sure.
whatever they're developing, they're testing on their really, really fast machine. And as that goes to other people, they end up with a slower experience if they're not on the really fast thing. So what we might think is really fast today, as you said, it's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of Apple's potential, right? Especially, like, these are just basically confirmed rumors at this point that they have something that's just 4 times as good as this. It's not 4 times faster on single core. It's just 4 times faster on multi-core, on GPU, on memory bandwidth. Like, you just take 4 of them, basically. It scales easily. They have the thermal headroom. obviously.
Yeah.
So, and it's not even like overclocking. We have no idea what kind of potential there is there to get something faster if you just crank up the speed on the accelerator, if you will. So what we have ended up with as an industry is people that got used to something that was reasonably good, and something that like I would never have experienced if I did not decide to go into iPhone development, like, I don't know, 15 years ago now, is the constraint of having something that is not as fast as what you're working with. Because what we've gone used to is something that is so fast that we don't have to think about performance generally at all anymore. But a result of that is that we don't think about performance at all anymore. And that's a big problem because like the fact that Xcode is slow at all, that's an issue for people that do the kind of work that we do, right? You see everyone gushing about how Final Cut Pro has always been fast on no matter anything. It will kind of adapt to make your workflow work. If you have super high resolution footage, it's going to make proxy footage so that way you can work fast. Right. There's nothing like that for Xcode, really. If your computer's too slow to autocomplete, your computer's too slow to autocomplete. It's not going to use a simpler indexing algorithm to kind of get you results faster for your use case. And if there was never an iPhone that I had to kind of develop against, and I'm talking about the very first iPhone, the painfully slow one, then I would have never learned how to care about performance in a way that might seem negligible now. Like everyone is always on about how you should never what's that phrase, that you should never go about and like tune for performance unless like there's a need for it. Like premature optimization is the root of all evil, basically.
Right.
And there is some truth to that, but I think that that is something that as a junior, you should totally be okay with. Like you should not stress those details at that point in your career. You should concentrate on getting good at being a problem solver and solving problems. But at year 3, 4, or 5, you need to start thinking about getting better as a developer and prematurely optimizing stuff that probably doesn't need optimization, but you are going to save a watt here or there in terms of battery. It's not going to make things faster. Like you're already well under the frame refresh limit for what you're doing, so you're not going to have a noticeable performance increase from this, but you are going to have a battery life increase from not taxing the system as much, you know?
Yeah.
And there is always a benefit to doing that because the more everyone does that as a whole, kind of like what everyone says, like we're all living on the planet together, the less energy we consume as a whole is better for the planet and the environment in general. Like the planet doesn't care, but everything that lives in the planet cares very much. It's like, as George Carlin says, the earth made us for plastic. It just wanted a lot of plastic. And thus it made humans. So I think it's still an important thing that you as a developer need to practice, especially as you become a senior developer. And just kind of brushing it aside as like, oh, like everything works fine. Yeah. Even on the slowest device that I'm using today, your software is still going to be used for quite a while. And the slowest device that is available today may still be used for another 5 years. And if things drastically get faster and faster every year from then on, then it's going to be left in the dark. And we've seen this with iOS devices. iOS devices get slower and slower to the point where Apple has been accused of intentionally making them slower so people buy new devices, as if that is a good business practice that you're going to swear by a company for it because they're making your device slower, then you're going to buy the new shiny one because you care very much about how that company is business, apparently. That's like a good reason. And that's really unfortunate that we've gone to the situation where we don't optimize anymore, even if there's nothing measurable to optimize. There's like simple things of like not calling the same property more than once when you can store it in a variable. Like nothing's gonna give you a measurement of how much better that is, right? But you can take that proactive step. Like, you know that property does something in the background, cache it, you know?
Yeah.
The compiler, if what you're doing is useless, the compiler will make it just as useless. Don't worry about that. But there are certain things that you know that the compiler doesn't, that it can't help you with. And being able to improve on those aspects, I think, is a really important thing.
That's totally fair. I mean, is it the iPhone 6s that still is running iOS 15? Is that like the lowest? That is so old. It is insane.
And it's hard to, like, if you do something with SwiftUI, it does not run well on the iPhone 6s.
I was just going to say, SwiftUI is probably a prime example of that would, I mean, even on newer phones, I've seen it lag. So on something that old, 5 years old, yeah, that would be rough. So,
and I hate to poo-poo on like differential data, diffable data sources. Like, that seems magical. You take two collections and you just compare them and you get results, right? Guess what's faster than that? Knowing what you changed. If you keep track of that, it's going to be more efficient than that, and it's going to work a little bit better. And if you're dealing with a data set that's 1,000 things, it's going to still work with 10,000 things, because you know exactly where you're inserting things and you're keeping track of that. And yes, It's hard. It's not simple stuff to get your head around. It's very confusing once you start having insertions and removals that can happen at the same time. But your users that are on older devices are going to be thankful to you for that, especially, and again, we've been in a state of computing where things have not increased year over year, and things have been relatively slow. However, on mobile, things have been increasing year over year at a tremendous pace, and we as developers, we got used to that on, like, oh, they'll just buy a newer iOS device and things will be fine. But people are not buying new iOS devices. People are still on the iPhone 6s, for instance.
Right.
And they are updating their OSs, and every now and then Apple goes back and rewrites a significant portion of the OS and makes it better. Like, for instance, if you've noticed that on Catalina, Big Sur, and Monterey, the Windows server just seems more smooth. That's because it was rewritten in Metal to take advantage of all those things. And that's especially obvious on the M1 Max, where you can change display resolution and it's instant. No fade to black, no recalculation of things. It's just an instant operation of just changing display resolutions. Plugging and unplugging displays is very similar. And as I mentioned before, like when the cat walks over that part of my table and that jostles the display connector ever so slightly, the display turns off. All my windows flash onto the other three displays, and then the display comes back and all the windows flash back. Every now and then the windows rotate, and the ones that were on the right end up in the middle, and the ones that were on the left. Like, it's a little kooky, and I'm not sure that I'm happy with it. But it happened so quickly that, like, I
You're
had
not
to...
waiting
Weren't these windows over there? Like, I didn't see it happen, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, on Intel Max, you'd be waiting 5-10 seconds just for it to flash a couple times and come back, so...
Oh, yeah. And like, the more displays you have, the more times it flashes. And it's like, oh no, it's going for another flash again. And then you're like really waiting for everything to figure out where it wanted to be. And that was like a nightmare. But because Apple rewrote that significant portion of the operating system, the Windows server, the things that shows you Windows, that is something that is much faster now that it's on hardware that can take advantage of it. However, on hardware that can't, it's even worse than it was. So, like, I get it. There's a lot of trade-offs that happen. Coding becomes easier the more abstractions you have. But at a certain point, your abstractions are built on abstractions, and there's slowdowns and unoptimized pieces at every level here that, yes, on a new computer, everything will be fast and smooth. But imagine what we were running on computers 20 years ago. Like, the mouse input is still faster on those computers. Because guess what? The mouse is not rendered by the operating system. The mouse is rendered by the mouse. The mouse actually has hardware in the computer to put a mouse on screen based on where the mouse physically is telling it to move the signals to. So that is just a faster thing. Like, you're never going to be faster than that.
Right.
And meanwhile, our now software-driven mice have gone slower and slower and slower. Which, yeah.
It's a
I'm
bummer.
heated.
I can tell. No, but it's true. I mean, even sometimes I'll notice like my trackpad doesn't want to like click fast enough. I don't know. It's like a weird thing where it like almost feels heavy to click because the rest of the computer was lagging.
Yeah, because the computer has to tell the trackpad, hey, make it seem like you clicked.
Right. Yes, exactly. I haven't experienced
like it doesn't have a clicker in it. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So trade-offs.
Yeah.
Bunches of trade-offs for sure.
So learn about how you can make your code better and don't skip on those improvements, especially as you gain more experience. Again, if you're just starting out, it's not super important to concentrate on this. Instead, learn how to be good at problem solving, because that is going to help you far more in coding than anything else. But once you learn that, start learning how to be more efficient at what you do. Like, it's going to become automatic at a certain point, like factorizing variables and making things as pleasant to read as it is to actually run. Like, code that is easy for you to understand, guess what? You're the slowest processor that exists. So if you can understand it in an easy way, chances are the compiler can understand it pretty much just as well. And it's going to be easier on it than something that was super obtuse. But if you need to make something super obtuse to eke out that extra performance, document it and make it super obtuse, because that's going to benefit everyone, especially if other people are building on what you're building. So
sage advice.
This week's episode of Code Completion is brought to you by Huuuungry. Huuuungry, that's hungry with 3 U's, is the iPhone, iPad, and Apple Watch app you turn to when you really want to eat but are blinded by the multitude of choices available to you and your insatiable hunger. Huuuungry isn't here to help you discover new restaurants or flavors. No, it has a much more humble purpose. You tell it all about your favorite restaurants, and it will deploy its cryptographically advanced random number generator, invoked by shaking your phone in frustration, to make a decision of what to eat for you. Stuck at home in quarantine and sick of ordering pizza? Use Huuuungry. Did Huuuungry just suggest pizza again? Don't fret, as options for another cuisine, a cheaper option, something closer, or simply another option are a button away. Huuuungry also comes with a collection of fun animated iMessage stickers so you can share your hunger with others. Thanks again to Huuuungry for sponsoring our show. Search for Huuuungry, that's Huuungry, on the App Store today to give it a try. So now that we're done with our topics, it's time for Complete the Code, where we quiz our listeners on your knowledge of Swift, Apple, and all things development. Spencer?
Yes. So last week, our question asked how you can make a Swift enum available in Objective-C, and we have a winner who is Vladislav Prusakov, who suggested giving the enum a raw value of int or uint and marking it with @obj_c, which is absolutely correct. There's an alternative if you wanted. You could declare your enum in Objective-C first, or rather in Objective-C as opposed to Swift, with ns_enum instead, which will ultimately make the enum available in both languages. So this week we have a Swift async question for you. If you're listening to the podcast, of course, you can check the podcast art or the show notes to follow along. So the question is, here we have an async method that loads an image and loads metadata separately, and then ultimately presenting them as a single unit. How can you make sure that both load methods run concurrently?
So thank you, Spencer. I'm really excited to use more async await code now that it actually landed with backporting capabilities. So if you download Xcode 13.2, I believe, you can run it as far back as iOS 13 and macOS 10.15, which is Catalina. So yeah, it's going to be exciting making use of this in your own code and seeing how you can get rid of a lot of dispatch queue stuff.
Love that they backported it. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. So it's not available for like URL session and all the foundation stuff. But I think John Sandell wrote an article recently where he basically rewrote the async await methods that URL session essentially vends, and like it basically explains how you can basically do this for anything that takes closures regularly. So nice. If you wanted to use any of the new async await stuff that is now available, you can basically write a little shim library that makes it available to all the older stuff and start using it today.
Sweet.
So if you think you can complete the code, tweet your answers to us with hashtag CompleteTheCode, all one word. The first to get it right will get a shout out on next week's show. And as always, I want to personally thank everyone for listening in this week. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter at CodeCompletion to know when new episodes get released, and feel free to tweet at us if there's ever a topic you'd like for us to dig into. Most importantly, as a small podcast, please be sure to share this with your friends and family who are also interested in any part of the process of app development. It's really your support that enables us to continue doing this, and we hope to grow a healthy community around everything we discuss. Once again, I want to give my thanks to Spencer, who is at Spencer C. Curtis, that's SpencerCurtis, on Twitter for joining me this week. My name once again is Dimitri. You can find me at Dimitri Buñol, that's DimitryBouniol, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye.
Bye.